The morning began quietly. Too quietly. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, dawn on the Normandy coast had always carried the same uneasy stillness. A thin mist clung to the shoreline, blurring the boundary between sea and sky. The English Channel lay flat and gray, like cold metal stretched to the horizon. The air smelled of salt, damp sand, and rusted steel, the familiar scent of a coastline turned into a fortress. It was just after 5 in the morning. Richter adjusted his greatcoat against the chill and lifted his binoculars. This was supposed to be another routine watch, another hour of scanning empty water, another day of waiting for an invasion that had been promised for years and never came. The men had stopped believing it would happen here. Calais was closer. Calais made sense. That was what Berlin said. That was what the maps said. That was what the concrete and steel of the Atlantic Wall were built for. Normandy was a secondary sector. Important, yes, but not decisive. At least that's what they had been told. Through the mist, the horizon looked empty at first. Just sea. Just gray. Then Richter froze. Something was wrong. There was a shape where there should have been none. A dark smudge low against the waterline. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A weather front, perhaps. He adjusted the focus. The smudge didn't disappear. It grew. He lowered the binoculars, wiped the lenses, and raised them again. The shape had multiplied. Not waves, not clouds. Ships. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. The horizon itself seemed to harden, as if the sea had turned solid. The mist thinned just enough for silhouettes to emerge. Angular, mechanical, unnatural. Tall superstructures, antennae, masts, smokestacks. This was not a fleet. It was a city. A floating metropolis of steel, advancing in silence. Richter's breath caught in his throat. In that moment, before a single Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches below, before history gave names like Omaha and Utah their meaning, he understood something with terrifying clarity. The Reich was about to drown. For years, German soldiers along the Atlantic coast had lived inside a contradiction. They were told they were guarding Fortress Europe, the impenetrable western shield of the Third Reich. Concrete bunkers dotted the shoreline like permanent scars. Gun emplacements stared endlessly at the sea. Minefields lay buried beneath sand and grass. Steel obstacles waited offshore, angled to rip open the hulls of invading craft. On maps and propaganda posters, it looked unstoppable. In reality, it felt fragile. Supplies were short. Reinforcements were delayed. Many units were understrength, staffed with wounded veterans, conscripts, or men transferred from the Eastern Front to recover, or to die somewhere quieter. Richter had fought in Russia. He had seen real war. Normandy felt like exile. The men joked about it. They called the Channel the world's widest moat. They said the British and Americans didn't have the courage to cross it, that if an invasion came, it would be crushed at the waterline. But the jokes were thin. Everyone knew the truth. They never said out loud. If the Allies came with everything they had, no wall would be thick enough. Still, the waiting dragged on. Until this morning. Richter lowered his binoculars slowly, his hands trembling despite the cold. He turned toward the bunker entrance and shouted for the radio operator. Within minutes, alarms began to sound along the coast. Uneven at first, then spreading like a chain reaction. Searchlights flickered to life in the fading darkness. Soldiers stumbled from bunks, pulling on boots and helmets, still half asleep, still unsure whether this was another false alarm. But the sound from the sea changed everything. A low rumble, distant but unmistakable, rolled across the water. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was engines, thousands of them. As the mist continued to lift, the impossible became undeniable. Warships, landing craft, transports. Lines upon lines stretching beyond sight, from north to south, filling the channel as far as the eye could see. Some men stood frozen, staring. Others swore. A few laughed, the brittle, hysterical laugh of someone whose world has just collapsed. "This isn't possible," someone whispered. But it was. The invasion was real, and it was here. In Berlin, the idea of such a force had been debated endlessly. Could the Allies really coordinate something this large? Could they land under fire? Could they sustain it? German intelligence had convinced itself that the answer was no, or at least not here. Deception had done its work. But deception only matters until the moment reality arrives. And reality had arrived in the form of steel and smoke. As dawn broke fully, the sea erupted. The first naval shells screamed overhead with a sound Richter had never heard before. A tearing, howling shriek that seemed to rip the air apart. A second later, the ground shook violently as explosions slammed into the cliffs and fortifications behind the beach. Concrete cracked. Sand leapt into the air. The Atlantic Wall, that symbol of German certainty, began to crumble. Richter was thrown to the ground as a blast wave rolled through the observation post. Dust filled the air. The bunker lights flickered, then went dark. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed. This was not a raid. This was annihilation. For the soldiers defending Normandy, the invasion didn't begin with heroics or speeches. It began with confusion. Orders conflicted. Phone lines were severed. Radios crackled with fragments of reports. Landings higher. Paratroopers there. Bridges blown. Roads blocked. No one had the full picture. No one knew where the main attack was. That uncertainty was deadly. German doctrine depended on rapid counterattacks. Panzer divisions were supposed to strike the invaders before they could establish a foothold. But those divisions were held back, waiting for authorization that never came, or came too late. Some commanders hesitated, still convinced this was a diversion. Others saw the truth and could do nothing about it. Richter climbed back to his position as the shelling paused briefly. Smoke rose from the shoreline in thick black columns. The beach below, once quiet and empty, was now a violent blur of fire and movement. Landing craft surged toward shore, ramps dropping, men pouring out into the surf. The enemy was everywhere, and they kept coming. Machine guns opened up from German positions, cutting lines through the advancing troops. Mortars thumped rhythmically. Artillery batteries fired until barrels glowed hot. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the defenses might hold. Bodies lay scattered in the water. Craft burned. Waves turned dark with oil and blood. But the numbers never stopped. For every boat destroyed, 3 more replaced it. For every man killed, 10 more took his place. This wasn't bravery alone. This was industrial warfare at a scale Germany could no longer match. Richter felt a strange detachment settle over him. This wasn't fear anymore. It was inevitability. He thought of Russia, of endless Soviet formations grinding forward no matter the cost. And now he saw the same logic applied with Western precision and overwhelming resources. The Allies had learned how to wage total war, and Germany was on the receiving end. By mid-morning, the skies changed too. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was barely present. A few fighters appeared briefly, only to be driven off or shot down by swarms of enemy aircraft. Above Normandy, the Allies owned the air. Bombers droned overhead. Fighters strafed roads, fields, and retreating columns. Any movement during daylight became a death sentence. The defenders were being crushed from sea, land, and sky, simultaneously. As the day wore on, reports became darker. Paratroopers behind the lines, bridges captured, villages overrun, entire units cut off and destroyed. Command posts wiped out before they could issue a single order. The invasion wasn't just breaking through the Atlantic Wall. It was tearing the German defensive system apart from the inside. Richter realized then that the war he had known, with fronts and lines and orderly retreats, was over. This was something else. This was collapse. Late in the afternoon, he found himself alone at the observation post, staring once more at the horizon. The sea was still filled with ships, more ships than he could count. Fresh waves arriving, untouched, relentless. Behind him, Normandy burned. In front of him, the future loomed, vast, mechanical, unstoppable. The steel horizon had not just brought an invasion, it had brought an ending, and Klaus Richter knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any fear, that Germany would never recover from this day. The question was no longer whether the Reich would fall, only how long it would take, and how many would die before it did. By the afternoon of June 6th, the idea of a coastline no longer existed. What had once been a clear boundary between land and sea dissolved into chaos. Smoke, fire, screaming engines, shattered bodies, and the constant thunder of artillery. Normandy was no longer a place, it was a wound. For the German defenders, time stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into moments. There was no sense of progress, only endurance. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter moved between positions as shells continued to fall. The beach below him had changed shape. Craters filled with seawater. Obstacles lay twisted and broken. Burned landing craft formed jagged silhouettes against the surf. And still, the enemy kept coming. Richter noticed something unsettling. The Americans were no longer hesitating. Early in the morning, they had stalled, pinned down by fire, struggling to move beyond the waterline. Now, small groups began to break through. 10 men here, 20 there, crawling, running, dragging equipment up the bluffs. It wasn't a flood anymore. It was infiltration. And infiltration was harder to stop. German doctrine was built for clear fronts, defined enemies, visible lines. But this wasn't that kind of war. American soldiers appeared suddenly in unexpected places, behind bunkers, in ravines, among hedgerows thought to be secure. Radios crackled with confused reports, enemy troops inside the defenses, snipers firing from positions that shouldn't exist. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop a wave. Instead, it was being eaten from the inside. Richter took cover as another bombardment began. The shells no longer felt random. They felt precise. Artillery fire adjusted methodically, creeping closer, collapsing positions one by one. This wasn't panic fire. This was coordination. Someone out there could see them. Someone was guiding the destruction. The realization hit him hard. The Allies weren't improvising. They had planned this. Every bunker, every gun, every strong point. They knew where they were. Inside the command network, the situation unraveled rapidly. Field telephones were dead. Runners were cut down, crossing open ground. Orders arrived too late to matter. Or not at all. Some units fought fiercely, isolated and stubborn, refusing to yield ground even as they were surrounded. Others simply vanished, swallowed by smoke and explosions, leaving behind only silence. There was no grand collapse yet, just hundreds of small ones. Around midday, Richter received confirmation of something he had feared since dawn. No immediate armored counterattack was coming. The panzers were still waiting for authorization, waiting for certainty, waiting for a clarity that no longer existed. To Richter, this hesitation felt fatal. The invasion wasn't a probe. It wasn't a diversion. It was the main event. But somewhere higher up the chain of command, doubt still lingered, poisoned by months of deception, by false intelligence, by the belief that Normandy was only a distraction from a larger landing elsewhere. That belief was killing them. Richter thought back to the Eastern Front. There, hesitation meant death. Soviet forces punished weakness immediately. Delay turned into encirclement. Encirclement turned into annihilation. Here, on the coast of France, the same logic applied, only faster. The enemy had air superiority. They had naval dominance. They had numbers. And now, they had momentum. As afternoon turned toward evening, the soundscape changed. The thunder of naval guns faded slightly, replaced by the sharper cracks of rifles and machine guns closer inland. The battle was moving forward, away from the water. That terrified Richter more than the bombardment ever had, because once the enemy moved beyond the beaches, this was no longer a defensive battle. It was a chase. German soldiers began to withdraw in small groups, not because they were ordered to, but because survival demanded it. Some positions were simply untenable, too exposed, too damaged, too isolated. Retreat happened without maps, without coordination, just instinct, just fear, just exhaustion. Along narrow roads and sunken lanes, men moved cautiously through the hedgerows, weapons ready, nerves stretched thin. Every rustle of leaves sounded like an ambush. Every shadow felt hostile. The Americans had adapted quickly to the terrain. They learned to move quietly, to flank, to strike and disappear. Normandy's countryside, once considered an obstacle for invaders, became their ally. For the Germans, it became a maze. Richter encountered a group of wounded soldiers gathered near a shattered farmhouse. Some were being treated with makeshift bandages. Others lay still, staring at nothing. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. One man asked quietly whether the Luftwaffe would come. No one answered. Late in the day, news arrived that sealed Richter's understanding of what was happening. Multiple beachheads were holding. Not just one. Several. The Allies had survived the most dangerous phase, the landing itself. They were ashore, and they were staying. This was the moment every German officer dreaded, because history was clear on what came next. Once a foothold became a base, and a base became a port, the war turned irreversible. And ports would follow. They always did. As darkness approached, something unexpected happened. The fighting didn't stop. It changed. The night filled with sporadic gunfire, sudden flares, whispered commands in unfamiliar accents. Paratroopers, scattered but dangerous, moved through the countryside, linking up, regrouping, striking isolated units. German soldiers feared the night now. The darkness no longer belonged to them. Richter spent the night in a shallow trench, unable to sleep. His ears rang constantly. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. He watched the sky, illuminated intermittently by flares and distant fires. Somewhere out there, thousands of Allied soldiers were digging in, unloading supplies, bringing in more men, more weapons, more machines. The invasion wasn't slowing. It was accelerating. Near midnight, Richter allowed himself a thought he had avoided all day. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a strategic one. Germany no longer had the strength to recover from a blow like this. The Eastern Front was bleeding them dry. The air war was destroying their cities. Now the West had opened, not with a crack, but with a rupture. 2 fronts had become 3, and the Reich could barely hold one. In the early hours of June 7th, Richter looked westward once more. The sea was still full of ships, unloading, reinforcing, expanding. The steel horizon had not receded. It had come ashore, and with it came the certainty that the war had entered its final chapter, whether anyone in Berlin was ready to admit it or not. For the men on the ground, there were no speeches left, no illusions, only orders to survive another day in a war that was slipping beyond control. The war did not end in Normandy, but it changed there forever. Weeks passed, and the landscape continued to shift eastward, not with a sudden break, but with a steady, irreversible pressure. The Allied front expanded like a tide that no barrier could hold. Every day brought more men, more machines, more certainty. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the meaning of the word defense dissolved completely. Defense required stability. Stability no longer existed. What remained of the German army in the West fought with discipline, sometimes with brilliance, often with desperation. But they were fighting physics now. Weight, mass, production, air power, time. Things no soldier could outshoot, no courage could outlast. At night, Richter listened to the distant thunder of artillery and understood something he had never fully grasped before. Wars are not won by moments. They are won by systems. And Germany's system had failed. The men spoke less as the days went on, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it would make it real. Everyone felt it. The war was no longer a question. It was a countdown. Richter passed through villages liberated without resistance. The enemy no longer needed to fight everywhere. They simply moved around pockets of resistance and let them wither. This was not defeat by destruction. This was defeat by irrelevance. In quiet moments, Richter thought about that first morning again, about the mist, about the silence before the engines, about the moment when the horizon stopped being natural and became something else entirely. That was when the war truly ended, even if no one admitted it yet. Years later, historians would measure D-Day in numbers. Ships landed, divisions deployed, casualties counted. Miles advanced, but numbers could never explain what it felt like to stand on that coast and watch the future arrive. To realize that history had chosen a side, and it was not yours. The steel horizon was not just Allied ships, it was inevitability made visible. It was the moment belief lost its power. Germany would continue to fight because wars do not stop when they are lost. They stop when there is nothing left to lose. But for those who saw the sea that morning, who watched the impossible become real, the ending had already begun. Richter survived the war. Many did not. Some returned home to ruins, others to silence. Some never spoke of Normandy again, but all of them carried the same image, whether they admitted it or not. A horizon that moved, a world that shifted, a future that arrived without asking permission. And that is how the war in Europe truly turned. Not with a surrender, not with a speech, but with steel, stretching across the sea until there was nowhere left to hide.